The morning mist lingered stubbornly over Flaxford's High Street, curling around the gables of the bakery and the brass-handled doors of the post office with a faint, almost conspiratorial insistence. Shopkeepers bustled about, brushes in hand, sweeping the pavements with a care that suggested both pride and an aversion to scandal. Early risers nodded at each other in quiet acknowledgement, the nods deliberate, polite, and carefully measured, as though excessive enthusiasm might betray some weakness. To a casual observer, all was orderly as it should be, yet Inspector Purbright, strolling with deliberate slowness toward the village hall, found himself alert to the subtle undercurrents, the half-smiles, the tiny discomfitures beneath courteous facades. The annual Garden Club exhibition was in full swing, and the hall smelled faintly of compost, chrysanthemums, and freshly polished wood. Purbright, whose interest in horticulture was limited to the human behavior it unveiled, noted the strategic positioning of hats, the careful folding of gloves, and the occasional hurried exchange of whispers behind bouquets of tulips. The ladies of the club, impeccable in their feigned serenity, measured each other with quick, almost imperceptible glances, while gentlemen pretending to admire flowers occasionally adjusted their jackets or cleared their throats, each movement a subtle negotiation of social hierarchy. It was Mr. Basil Trent, corpulent and perpetually flushed, who broke the rhythm. He stopped abruptly before a display of hybrid irises, his expression one of theatrical alarm. "My word!" he exclaimed, just loud enough to attract the attention of nearby observers. "Someone's tampered with the sunfire blooms. Look at the centre petals. They're gone." A low murmur spread through the hall, polite in volume, but insistent in its curiosity. Hats tilted ever so slightly, collars were adjusted, and eyes darted from Mr. Trent to the flowers with the kind of careful calculation that spoke of hidden anxieties. Each villager seemed to consult an internal ledger of respectability, worried that noticing or failing to notice the missing petals might reflect poorly upon them. Purbright approached the irises with a calm he made to seem habitual, inspecting the plants with the patience of someone reading an intricate map. The stems were neatly cut, soil undisturbed. Nothing in the obvious evidence suggested malice, yet he noticed the slight irregularity in the pattern of the missing petals, the subtle difference in sunlight exposure, the faint indentation in the soft soil where someone might have leaned. None of it was proof of wrongdoing, but it was proof of human presence and, therefore, potential mischief. Mr. Trent continued to wave his hands, nearly overturning a small pot in his agitation, while the hall filled with a gentle hum of speculation. Lady Witherspoon leaned over to her companion, whispering in a tone of moral concern about rival gardeners and the degeneration of village standards. The vicar, who had arrived with no particular interest in flowers, nodded gravely, as though the removal of petals were a reflection on the moral fibre of the parish itself. Meanwhile, a young assistant named Elsie attempted, with varying degrees of success, to soothe Mr. Trent while arranging the disrupted display back into some semblance of order. Purbright observed all of it, not with impatience, but with an exacting attentiveness. The way Mr. Trent's hand trembled slightly when he insisted on moving closer to inspect a bloom, the way Lady Witherspoon's eyes narrowed when she thought no one watched, the brief but telling hesitation of the hall steward when asked if the door had been locked the night before, each was a note in a quiet symphony of human behavior, subtle enough that only someone trained in its interpretation could discern the tune. By the time the hall had settled into a careful hum of polite curiosity, Purbright had already catalogued a number of contradictions. The petals had not been removed haphazardly. Someone had deliberately altered them, and yet the gesture was almost apologetic in its precision, as though the culprit wished to provoke neither chaos nor accusation. Even the missing notebook of a visiting journalist, which was later discovered by the hall steward tucked under a fern, suggested an element of misdirection, an attempt to draw attention away from the real act, modest though it may have been. Conversations resumed, though tempered by caution. People spoke in measured tones, choosing their words as though navigating a labyrinth of social expectations. Mr. Trent complained in hushed urgency, Lady Witherspoon offered florid, moralizing commentary, and Purbright continued to watch and listen, his mind cataloguing behaviour with a patience that seemed almost ceremonial. Even the hall itself, with its polished floors and sunlight streaking through tall windows, became a silent witness, holding on to impressions of gestures, whispers, and frowns with a clarity that the casual observer would never appreciate. And so the exhibition continued, outwardly ordinary but undercut by the minor anomaly that had disrupted the expected sequence of civility. Purbright, unhurried and polite, made mental notes of each individual's reaction, each subtle glance, each over-emphasized remark. He understood the village too well to jump to conclusions, yet he knew that the smallest disruptions often concealed the most revealing truths. The petals were gone, yes, but the implications, social, behavioral, perhaps even criminal, were only just beginning to unfold. By the time the morning had given way to a brighter, less misty day, a sense of quiet unease had settled over the hall. The villagers, unaware of the intricate web forming beneath their noses, continued to admire, discuss, and gossip, each action layered with self-interest and subtle competitive instinct. Purbright, standing slightly apart and sipping a cup of weak tea offered by the hall steward, allowed himself a faint, almost imperceptible smile. He knew that the removal of a few petals could reveal far more about Flaxford's inhabitants than 1,000 words of polite conversation, and he intended to find out exactly what. By the following afternoon, the village of Flaxford was alive with murmurs that wound their way from the bakery to the post office, from the cobbled high street to the quiet lanes behind the parish church. The missing petals had, in the space of 24 hours, become a matter of considerable speculation, though no one could quite agree on the significance. In the snug interior of the coffee-house, whispers ricocheted between tables. Mrs. Fenton, the proprietor, polished her counter nervously, listening while offering polite nods and murmured affirmations. She had heard of Mr. Trent's discovery and, naturally, had added several embellishments of her own. Lady Witherspoon, seated in her habitual corner near the window, seemed to delight in the moral implications of the incident. She had already formulated a narrative in which the petals' disappearance was a deliberate attack on the village's propriety, possibly orchestrated by a jealous rival or a malcontented gardener. She shared this theory with anyone who would nod politely and feign agreement, while her own eyes flicked toward the window, as if hoping for visual confirmation of her suspicion. Tom Brindle, for his part, seemed almost pleased by the attention directed at him, though he neither confessed nor denied anything. His father muttered darkly about the boy's supposed inclination to mischief, and yet Tom's outward composure suggested that he enjoyed the subtle unease he inspired. Purbright, who had taken a quiet seat at the back, observed this interplay with measured curiosity, noting both the tension in Mr. Brindle's father's jaw and the smug tilt of Tom's head. Each gesture, however slight, added a thread to the complex tapestry of social interplay, and each thread seemed as revealing as any overt statement. Meanwhile, the vicar walked with deliberate calm along the high street, offering vague observations about the moral climate of Flaxford and the dangers of indulgence in petty jealousies. He spoke softly to a passing neighbour, making sure to express a mixture of concern and disapproval, while his thoughts seemed to linger on the more intricate dynamics of the garden club itself. Purbright, as always, noted the careful modulation of tone, the faint hesitation before certain words, the way his eyes momentarily sought validation, even in solitary conversation. Dr. Langley, a visiting physician, added another layer of ambiguity when he casually mentioned having glimpsed a figure near the hall late in the previous evening. The remark, almost incidental, set certain villagers' minds racing, while others dismissed it as inconsequential. This suggestion of a stranger, or at least an unusual presence, cast new light on the incident, introducing the possibility that it might be neither trivial nor entirely internal to the garden club. Yet the doctor offered no further detail, merely leaving the statement hanging like a subtle question mark in the air. The florist, whose stall overlooked the hall, had his own interpretation and shared it with anyone who approached, insisting that the petals had been removed intentionally by someone seeking recognition or perhaps revenge. His customers listened politely, nodding in acknowledgement, though some did so with a faint sense of disbelief. Every conversation, however slight, reinforced a network of gossip that was at once intricate and unreliable, a web woven from partial truths, personal biases, and small-town ambition. Even children, sent on errands for their parents, contributed to the growing cascade of rumors. Passing from house to house, they repeated fragments of conversations they only half understood, each repetition slightly altered by imagination or emphasis. By mid-morning, the story had evolved beyond petals to include minor scandals, imagined rivalries, and the suggestion of secret alliances that might stretch back for decades. Purbright listened to these reports with polite attention, cataloguing the distortions without allowing himself to react, for he understood that the value of gossip lay not in its veracity, but in what it revealed about character. By late afternoon, the village seemed to vibrate with quiet anticipation. Shop windows displayed flowers with more care than usual, neighbours exchanged furtive glances, and the mayor, seeing an opportunity to assert authority, suggested that a formal inquiry might be necessary, though his voice carried no urgency. Purbright observed the entire tableau with calm detachment. The gossip had done much of his work for him, revealing loyalties, insecurities, and subtle motives with far greater efficiency than any interrogatory. And yet, for all the noise and speculation, the truth remained hidden, masked by the polite veneers and carefully managed impressions of the villagers. Purbright understood that in a community such as Flaxford, the smallest detail could unravel the grandest assumptions, and that patience, observation, and restraint were more potent than any immediate judgment. As the day drew to a close and the evening light softened the edges of the town, he reflected quietly that while gossip could inflame suspicion, it could also illuminate character in ways more subtle and enduring than any direct evidence. The ripple of rumors continued, gentle but persistent, carrying each villager along with it, while Purbright maintained the unhurried vigilance that would allow him to discern fact from polite fiction, truth from theatrical misdirection, and in this, as in all things, he moved as the calm center of a small, restless storm, waiting patiently for the next turn of events to reveal itself. The following morning found Inspector Purbright at the Garden Club Hall, once more, this time under the pretext of extending polite inquiries. The hall itself had settled into a semblance of normality, though traces of the previous day's unease lingered faintly in the arrangement of chairs and the careful spacing of potted plants. Purbright made his entrance with customary calm, nodding to familiar faces and offering measured pleasantries. His purpose, of course, was not merely social. Every polite word exchanged, every casual glance, was a means of eliciting information from those who might otherwise conceal it beneath layers of civility. He began with the hall's steward, a nervous man who preferred the company of dusters and polished wood to social interaction. Mr. Hargreaves, flustered by the inspector's serene demeanour, stumbled over his words as he recounted the hall's closing procedures from the previous evening. Nothing overtly suspicious appeared in his account, yet Purbright noted the slight hesitation before mentioning the locked door, the subtle tightening of his mouth when asked about visitors after hours. Each pause, each adjustment of spectacles was catalogued as potential evidence of either forgetfulness or deliberate concealment. Next, he spoke with Mrs. Elsie Kettle, assistant to the garden club president, who seemed eager to demonstrate her competence and loyalty. She detailed the arrangement of the flowers, the careful labeling, and the reactions of the various club members to the discovery of the missing petals. Her narrative was precise but occasionally over-elaborate, betraying a desire to impress, or perhaps to redirect attention from details she would rather not disclose. Purbright listened patiently, making no overt comment, yet every inflection and emphasis in her speech was noted for later consideration. Mr. Basil Trent, whose dramatic protest had caused the initial stir, was questioned next. He recounted with characteristic flair the exact sequence of his discovery, embellishing slightly with theatrical hand gestures and exclamations that he seemed to consider necessary for clarity. Purbright, with polite restraint, allowed the man to speak at length, interrupting only once to clarify a minor detail about the orientation of the irises. In that moment of clarification, he observed a micro-expression, a fleeting shadow of unease, before Mr. Trent resumed his confident manner. Such small deviations, Purbright knew, often concealed the key to understanding motives and truths that no one would state outright. The inspector then turned to Lady Witherspoon, who was at once delighted and mildly affronted to be consulted. She recounted her version of events with a mixture of moral outrage and delicate propriety, emphasizing the potential threat to the village's reputation. Purbright noted with quiet amusement the subtle way she adjusted her gloves and leaned forward when describing what she perceived as the deliberate intent of an unknown culprit. Every gesture, every carefully modulated word added nuance to the social map he was constructing, revealing alliances and rivalries invisible to those caught up in the surface chatter. Finally, he spoke with a few of the lesser-known club members who had been present at the exhibition. Their accounts were more mundane, often conflicting and sometimes contradictory, yet each contained tiny inconsistencies, the sort that most people would dismiss as forgetfulness, but which, under patient observation, began to reveal patterns. One noted that a particular pot had seemed slightly displaced. Another claimed to have overheard someone muttering about correcting the display. And a third mentioned that Mr. Trent had seemed unusually pleased when announcing the petal's absence. Each fragment, innocuous alone, contributed to the broader picture of village dynamics and hidden agendas. As Purbright concluded his inquiries, he reflected on the interplay of manner and motive, of subtle deception and inadvertent revelation. The villagers were careful to preserve appearances, yet in doing so, they betrayed themselves in the smallest ways, through hesitation, over-precision, or unnecessary emphasis. He had learned much more from listening than he could ever have learned from observation alone, for the nuances of tone and timing often spoke louder than facts themselves. By mid-afternoon, the inspector had pieced together a preliminary understanding of the social landscape. He understood who enjoyed dominance in the club, who nursed grievances, and who might act out of vanity or a sense of retribution. He made no overt conclusions, maintaining his serene detachment while cataloguing every gesture, every contradictory statement, every fleeting expression. The tapestry of human behavior was intricate, and he intended to allow it to reveal itself gradually as the threads were unwound naturally. Purbright left the hall quietly, his notebook filled with subtle observations rather than definitive answers. Outside, the light had softened, and the village seemed to carry on its usual rhythm, unaware of the careful scrutiny that had taken place within the hall. He walked slowly along the cobbled street, contemplating the delicate balance between appearance and reality, noting that even the smallest disruption, such as a few missing petals, could illuminate the hidden currents that ran beneath the village's polite surface. The stage, he realized, was set, and the next act of this understated drama would soon make itself known. By mid-morning, the small village of Flaxford had settled into its customary rhythm, though a faint tension lingered beneath the surface of polite conversation. The news of the tampered irises had travelled far and wide, reaching the ears of those who had not been present at the Garden Club exhibition. Inevitably, speculation coalesced around a single name: young Tom Brindle, the village lad, known for minor mischief and a curious habit of testing the boundaries of propriety. His reputation, harmless enough on ordinary days, suddenly cast a long shadow over the otherwise tranquil community. Tom's father, a stern and habitually muttering man, became the de facto spokesperson for the family. "He's a handful, that one," he muttered repeatedly to anyone within earshot, emphasizing each word with a sharp tap of his boot on the cobbles. "I've warned him countless times. That boy can't resist the temptation to poke about where he shouldn't." Villagers nodded in solemn agreement, some adding their own anecdotes of Tom's previous escapades, a half-eaten tart here, a misplaced gardening implement there. All were minor in isolation, yet collectively they painted a picture of a child with both curiosity and impishness, perfectly suited to bear the weight of communal suspicion. Purbright, seated discreetly in a nearby chair at the village coffee-house, observed the unfolding narrative with his habitual detachment. He listened as neighbours recounted Tom's supposed guilt, noting the peculiar precision with which each person filled gaps in their recollection. It was not the facts themselves that concerned him, but the manner in which they were presented, the slight hesitation, the careful enunciation, the subtle gestures that accompanied each assertion. In a community such as Flaxford, even the most trivial embellishments could reveal far more about human character than any overt evidence. Tom, aware of the growing scrutiny, remained outwardly unconcerned, wandering the high street with an air of almost theatrical nonchalance. He tipped his hat to passing neighbours, greeted the butcher with a cheerful wave, and occasionally cast a sidelong glance toward the hall where the petals had disappeared. Each movement was deliberate, each smile carefully measured. For the casual observer, he appeared merely playful, perhaps a little reckless. To Purbright, however, the subtleties of posture, hesitation, and expression offered a far richer narrative. Meanwhile, the village constable, a man whose appreciation for nuance was as limited as his patience, insisted on formalizing suspicion. "It must have been him," he declared in the presence of the mayor, who nodded sagely as if the conclusion were both inevitable and comforting. The constable cited past incidents, minor infractions, and the boy's habitual curiosity, presenting them as proof sufficient to close the case. Purbright refrained from comment, listening quietly as the constable's confidence filled the room with an air of premature resolution. The villagers, naturally inclined to prefer tidy explanations, were quick to embrace the neat narrative. Conversations throughout the morning shifted almost entirely to Tom's supposed culpability. The baker recounted how he had once seen the boy leaning too close to a display of roses. The postmistress recalled an instance of mischief involving a misplaced letter, and even the florist offered anecdotal evidence of Tom's tendency to disturb carefully arranged displays. Each story, though unrelated to the missing petals, added weight to the collective judgment forming in the village mind. Yet beneath the surface of general agreement, Purbright detected subtle anomalies. Some villagers, though they nodded and murmured in apparent concurrence, displayed fleeting expressions of doubt. An arched eyebrow, a slight frown, or a brief hesitation before agreeing. These inconsistencies, minor as they seemed, suggested that the tidy assignment of blame might not be as complete as the community believed. Purbright made careful mental notes, understanding that such contradictions often held the key to discerning truth in human affairs. Tom, for his part, neither confirmed nor denied the accusations, yet a faint shadow of unease flickered across his otherwise composed demeanour. He answered questions with brevity, yet the inflection of his words hinted at a mixture of amusement and mild defiance. Purbright observed this with interest, noting how the boy's calm exterior both masked and revealed intent, and how the villagers' eagerness to believe in his guilt might blind them to subtler evidence. As the morning wore on, Purbright concluded his observations with a quiet reflection on the nature of communal judgment. The ease with which the village assigned blame, the apparent pleasure taken in a narrative that restored order and simplicity, revealed much about Flaxford itself. Politeness, propriety, and social hierarchy dictated the public story, but the private realities, fleeting doubts, small inconsistencies, and human quirks remained visible to the patient observer. In such a climate, truth was rarely self-evident. It required attention, patience, and an eye for those minute deviations that most overlooked. By noon, the narrative of Tom Brindle as the perpetrator had firmly taken root in the village consciousness, yet Purbright remained unconvinced. The boy's composure, the villagers' subtle uncertainties, and the minor contradictions in otherwise confident accounts all pointed to a more complex situation than the community imagined. The apparent simplicity of the case, he reflected, might prove entirely deceptive. He rose from his chair, adjusted his hat with habitual precision, and prepared to follow the next thread, knowing that patience would reveal the truth in its own time. The afternoon sun had softened over Flaxford, casting long, gentle shadows across the high street, and the village seemed, on the surface, to have returned to its accustomed rhythms. Yet Inspector Purbright, walking with deliberate calm toward the hall, sensed the quiet undercurrent of unease that persisted beneath the polite chatter. The assignment of blame to young Tom Brindle remained firmly entrenched in the minds of most villagers, yet subtle discrepancies and faint uncertainties continued to draw the inspector's attention. He had learned to trust such anomalies. The smallest detail, unnoticed by the crowd, often proved the most revealing. As he entered the hall, Purbright's eyes were immediately drawn to a corner where a small clay fertilizer bag had been left out of place, partially obscured by a chair leg. To the casual observer, it would have seemed a trivial oversight, yet its presence in that position was unusual. The bag was of a rare brand, one that had only recently been introduced by a travelling merchant, and it was unlikely that an ordinary member of the garden club would have used it without thought. Purbright crouched slightly to examine it, noting faint traces of soil on the edge of the hall's wooden floor that suggested someone had moved it with care rather than accident. A whisper of movement behind him drew his attention. Mrs. Elsie Kettle had returned to rearrange the irises, glancing nervously toward the displaced bag. Her hands hovered for a moment over the petals, then recoiled, almost as if she feared to disturb something she might regret. Purbright observed the hesitation with mild curiosity. It was subtle, barely perceptible, yet enough to suggest that she knew more than she had disclosed during prior inquiries. Every gesture, every pause, every faint expression formed a small, intricate clue in the larger tapestry he was assembling. Nearby, Mr. Basil Trent fussed with a display, oblivious to the subtle examination occurring mere feet away. He murmured complaints about the missing petals, attributing them once more to Tom's mischievous inclinations, unaware that the inspector's attention was fixed elsewhere. Purbright, patient as ever, allowed the man to speak at length, noting the occasional contradictions in his account. A flicker of memory suggesting that he had seen the petals missing before the exhibition, and a slight exaggeration of his own role in the discovery. Such contradictions were minute, but in Flaxford, minutiae often concealed truth. As he straightened, a faint remark reached his ears from the corner where a visiting journalist, Dr. Langley, had been observing the proceedings. He muttered something about patterns being too deliberate to be accidental, though the words were directed toward no one in particular. Purbright noted the remark, filing it alongside the displaced fertilizer bag and Mrs. Kettle's hesitation. Each fragment, seemingly minor on its own, suggested an underlying purpose behind the apparent chaos, hinting that the missing petals were not merely the product of childish mischief or careless oversight. The inspector's gaze wandered toward a small, leather-bound notebook left open on a side table, its pages filled with neat observations from the previous day. Among the floral notes, a brief annotation mentioned a shift in display alignment, a phrase that might have passed unnoticed, but, in combination with other subtle evidence, hinted at deliberate tampering. Purbright carefully closed the notebook, mindful not to disturb the alignment of the pages, and considered the possibilities. Someone had moved things with intent, whether to deceive, to conceal, or to provoke, was as yet unclear. He then allowed his attention to drift to the villagers themselves, noting how each responded to the minutiae around them. Lady Witherspoon hovered near the irises, adjusting her gloves in what seemed a ritualistic display of propriety. Her eyes, however, flickered toward the displaced bag, with a mixture of curiosity and disapproval, betraying a consciousness of more than she dared acknowledge aloud. Mr. Trent, meanwhile, continued his animated retelling to a small cluster of listeners, unaware of the faint smirk on Dr. Langley's face as he observed the scene. Even the children sent on minor errands paused occasionally to glance toward the misplaced objects, their idle curiosity weaving itself quietly into the overall tableau. By late afternoon, Purbright had catalogued a subtle but telling pattern. Small disruptions, slightly shifted objects, fleeting remarks, brief hesitations, each pointed toward a deliberate sequence of actions that had so far eluded detection. The obvious culprit, young Tom, remained a convenient narrative for the village at large, yet the evidence of intent, however understated, suggested a more calculated hand at work. Politeness and propriety had masked opportunity, but the accumulation of minor, curious details was beginning to form a map that only a patient observer could read. As the hall emptied for the day, Purbright lingered, noting the faint impressions of footsteps in the dust near the bag, the subtle discoloration on the petals that remained, and the precise manner in which the tables had been aligned. These minutiae, easily dismissed by all but the most observant, formed the core of what he considered an emerging enigma. The village, outwardly serene and bustling with the usual commerce of daily life, remained unaware that the quiet disturbances were part of a larger, deliberately orchestrated tableau. Purbright left the hall at dusk, his notebook filled with careful observations and faintly noted inconsistencies. The sun had dipped behind the western roofs, casting long shadows across the cobbles and lending the village a calm, almost deceptive serenity. Yet he knew the quiet detail, the small, seemingly trivial anomaly, was the first thread of a more intricate design. Patience, observation, and subtle interrogation would be required to unravel it fully, and he intended to follow the clues wherever they might lead. The next morning, Flaxford streets were quiet, save for the occasional clip-clop of a passing horse or the muffled conversation of early shoppers. To the casual observer, the village appeared to have returned to its ordinary routines, yet Purbright was acutely aware that beneath the familiar facades, a network of subtle tensions and hidden motives was steadily expanding. The Garden Club's minor scandal had rippled outward, drawing into its orbit a far wider array of characters than anyone had yet considered. Purbright's first call was to Miss Agnes Whitcomb, the retired schoolteacher whose sharp mind and long memory made her a repository of minor village grievances. She welcomed him into her tidy parlour with polite insistence, offering tea while launching immediately into an account of previous incidents in the hall that had been conveniently forgotten by the younger members. She mentioned rivalries, subtle slights, and occasional misunderstandings between the club's officers, all delivered with the air of one correcting a public oversight rather than confessing gossip. Purbright, as always, listened without judgment, noting not only the content of her recollections, but also the emphasis, hesitation, and self-satisfaction that coloured her delivery. From Miss Whitcomb, he turned to Mr. Clive Hargrove, the shopkeeper whose knowledge of village comings and goings was unparalleled. Hargrove's account was ostensibly mundane: deliveries, errands, and the routine interactions of his customers. Yet in the rhythm of his speech and the selective detail he offered, Purbright detected the faint suggestion that someone, perhaps more than one person, had taken a particular interest in the layout of the hall. The shopkeeper's careful avoidance of naming any names, combined with a fleeting twitch when asked about recent fertilizer orders, implied knowledge of events that had so far escaped wider notice. Even the housekeeper at the hall, Mrs. Pritchard, provided subtle insight. She recounted minor nocturnal disturbances, faint sounds in corridors, and objects found slightly displaced upon opening the hall each morning. She was careful, almost comically so, to present herself as a neutral observer, yet the inspector noted the precise way her hands tightened around the broom as she spoke. Her body language, coupled with the content of her observations, hinted at familiarity with the evening routines and perhaps awareness of someone moving with deliberate intent. As Purbright continued his inquiries, he gradually expanded the map of suspects, paying attention not only to overt actions, but to the invisible threads linking villagers through past grievances, small debts, and unspoken resentments. A retired gardener whispered about envy over awards, a shop assistant hinted at disputes over social invitations, and even the florist added casual remarks about unusual behavior among the club's more ambitious members. Each fragment, seemingly innocuous, formed part of an intricate web of relationships, petty rivalries, and concealed motives. Tom Brindle remained a figure of peripheral interest in these new accounts, largely absent from the stories beyond the initial suspicion. The attention of the village had begun to diffuse toward adults whose motives, while more subtle, carried the potential for deliberate manipulation. Purbright, as always, catalogued these observations without premature judgment, noting patterns, inconsistencies, and the occasional unintentional revelation that hinted at concealed actions. It was the interplay between character and circumstance, rather than any overt act of malice, that drew his particular focus. By midday, the hall seemed less a venue for flowers than a stage for village dynamics, each character performing roles both public and private. Purbright observed with faint amusement the ways in which people corrected themselves, smiled in cautious approval, or subtly shifted their positions in response to perceived scrutiny. Each gesture was small yet cumulatively significant, revealing the architecture of influence and expectation that governed behavior. Even minor tensions, who had been seated near whom, who had arranged which flowers, took on new importance, as subtle interactions often concealed deeper intent. Dr. Langley's presence, previously incidental, now became more relevant. The visiting physician who had earlier mentioned a late-night figure at the hall offered fleeting insights into subtle interactions he had witnessed, phrasing them as casual observations rather than accusations. Purbright noted these with interest, recognizing that even seemingly casual remarks could illuminate connections invisible to others more invested in the drama. Each observation, when paired with the growing network of minor grievances, hinted at an unseen pattern. Someone had been orchestrating minor disruptions for reasons beyond mere mischief. By late afternoon, the inspector's mental map had expanded considerably. He had accounted for rivalries, subtle acts of envy, minor moral judgments, and the unspoken power structures that defined daily life in Flaxford. The seemingly trivial tampering with petals and vegetables now appeared embedded in a broader, more deliberate social design. Yet the precise motive remained obscured, hidden behind layers of politeness and carefully managed appearances. As the day drew to a close, Purbright lingered on the steps of the hall, watching villagers return to homes, shops and routines that appeared undisturbed yet carried the subtle marks of quiet observation and concealed tension. The web he had traced was intricate and delicate, a network of human behavior that, like the petals themselves, revealed more in its absence and displacement than in its presence. Patience, careful attention, and the gradual unraveling of character would, he knew, eventually expose the hand behind the minor disruptions. The wider web was set, and only time would reveal its unseen architect. The morning was pale and misty, the air holding a chill that hinted at the approaching winter, and Flaxford stirred slowly into life. The village seemed outwardly unchanged, yet the hall of the garden club had become a focal point for quiet curiosity. Inspector Purbright arrived with his habitual, unhurried calm, aware that each day brought new revelations, however minor, and that the smallest detail could shift understanding in an instant. He had been reviewing his notes from the previous days, cataloguing minor anomalies, half-uttered remarks and subtle gestures, when a sudden report drew his attention. Another irregularity had been discovered. This time it was the vegetable competition that had been affected. A prized marrow, carefully nurtured by Mrs. Pritchard for weeks, had been found displaced from its display and replaced with an almost identical, though subtly misshapen, specimen. The hall had been locked overnight, and there were no signs of forced entry, yet the vegetable had clearly been handled, rotated, and repositioned with deliberate care. Mrs. Pritchard, distraught and flustered, insisted on showing Purbright the precise location, pointing out the faint impression of her fingers on the tablecloth where the replacement had been laid. Villagers gathered as news spread, some with curiosity, others with the faint excitement of witnessing a drama unfold beyond mere floral arrangements. Mr. Basil Trent was among the first to offer commentary, attributing the occurrence to Tom Brindle in his usual speculative manner. "He must have been at it again," he declared, eyebrows raised and lips pursed with certainty. Yet a glance from Purbright suggested the boy had been elsewhere during the night, and the subtle timing of events did not align with his movements. Purbright examined the vegetable, turning it gently in his hands. The replacement was imperfect in ways that suggested careful mimicry rather than casual tampering. He observed the way it had been positioned to approximate the original display, noting that some aspects, the angle of the stem, the orientation of the leaves, were slightly off. These minor discrepancies, easily overlooked by an untrained eye, hinted at an intelligence behind the act. Someone had intended the display to be altered without causing immediate suspicion, leaving room for confusion and misdirection. As he looked around the hall, the inspector noted the villagers' reactions. Lady Witherspoon whispered urgently to a companion about the moral implications of such behavior, while others nodded solemnly, eager to assign blame, yet hesitant to speculate beyond what was convenient. Dr. Langley, present as a neutral observer, murmured to Purbright that the pattern seemed almost intentional, like a quiet provocation. And the words, casual though they were, resonated with the inspector's own observations of subtle, deliberate interference. Purbright's attention shifted to minor details overlooked by the crowd. A small smudge of soil near the edge of the tablecloth suggested careful handling. The faint indentation of a shoe in the dust of the floor indicated someone had lingered longer than casual curiosity required, and the slight rotation of a nearby plant implied an attempt to mask the act as incidental. He catalogued these observations with methodical precision, aware that together they formed a more coherent picture than any single element alone could provide. The villagers absorbed in the drama did not notice his scrutiny. Mr. Trent recounted his morning errands and alleged sightings of the boy, embellishing the timeline in ways he likely did not realize. Mrs. Pritchard fretted over the potential embarrassment of her misaligned display, while Miss Whitcomb, the retired teacher, offered a commentary on the village's declining standards, her voice rich with both nostalgia and judgment. Purbright noted each nuance, each hesitation, each small deviation from truth, understanding that such subtleties often revealed far more than direct statements. He next spoke quietly with a hall attendant who had arrived early to open the doors. The attendant mentioned seeing a figure linger near the vegetable table the previous evening, though the memory was vague, and the person's identity uncertain. Purbright listened, making no direct comment, yet the description, a fleeting shadow, a careful hand adjusting a leaf, confirmed his suspicion that the disturbance was deliberate and not the act of an impulsive child. The precision, subtlety, and restraint implied knowledge of the hall's routines and an understanding of how small actions could provoke disproportionate attention. By mid-afternoon, Purbright had connected the threads. The missing petals, the replaced vegetable, and the carefully arranged anomalies all suggested a pattern of intentional disruption designed to mislead observers. The first assumption of Tom Brindle's culpability now seemed increasingly untenable, yet the villagers continued to cling to the simple explanation, comforted by its neatness. The inspector noted the tension this created between perception and reality, recognizing that the real author of the disturbances had skillfully manipulated appearances to their advantage. As the sun began to lower in the sky, casting a softer, warmer light across the hall, Purbright reflected on the implications of this second incident. The measured precision, the subtle misdirection, and the deliberate timing suggested that the orchestrator was both intelligent and intimately familiar with the village's rhythms. Flaxford's apparent tranquility masked a more complex interplay of observation, intention, and social calculation, and the inspector understood that patience and careful attention would be necessary to discern the true architect of the disruptions. He left the hall with a measured step, his mind cataloguing minor impressions, subtle behaviors, and hidden motives. The second anomaly had shifted the investigation, drawing attention away from the obvious suspect and opening the possibility of a more calculated orchestration behind the garden club's peculiar troubles. As he walked along the quiet streets, the soft hum of village life continued, but in his mind the pieces were beginning to align, revealing a pattern visible only to those willing to observe both the grand and the minute with equal care. The evening settled over Flaxford with a gentle hush, the mist retreating to the fields while the last tendrils of sunlight gilded the rooftops. Inspector Purbright strolled along the high street at a deliberate pace, the air crisp against his cheeks and the occasional flutter of leaves marking the passage of time. He had left the hall hours earlier, but the events of the day, the missing petals, the replaced vegetable, the subtle behaviors of the villagers, lingered in his mind with a quiet insistence. Walking alone allowed him to consider human nature with the patience it required, unhurried by chatter or expectation. He reflected first on the patterns he had observed, the deliberate care with which objects had been altered, the timing that ensured attention without immediate accusation, and the way social conventions had been manipulated to redirect blame. In Flaxford, appearances held an almost sacred weight, and even minor infractions could be amplified or concealed depending on the actor's skill. Politeness, propriety, and an adherence to routine created a framework within which intention could remain hidden, yet betrayals, however subtle, were rarely entirely invisible to a trained observer. Purbright considered the villagers themselves. Mr. Basil Trent's bluster, the vicar's measured moralizing, Lady Witherspoon's judicious indignation, and the quieter gestures of the assistants and attendants each revealed a spectrum of human motives. Pride, envy, vanity, and cautious self-interest all intersected in ways that were obvious only in combination. The inspector understood that no single act, no isolated observation, could convey the complexity of intent. It was the accumulation of small contradictions, of minute gestures and nuanced phrasing that revealed character and, ultimately, truth. The thought of young Tom Brindle returned unbidden. The boy's composure in the face of blame, his occasional deflection and subtle amusement suggested a personality keenly aware of social perception. Yet Purbright had noted with interest that the most careful misdirections, the displaced vegetable, the subtle anomalies in the hall, could not reasonably have been executed by a child. Patience, he reflected, was essential. The village's preference for a tidy narrative had obscured the broader pattern, but persistent observation would gradually unveil it. As he passed the post office, the inspector observed the small exchanges taking place between neighbours. Polite greetings, fleeting nods, and measured glances conveyed layers of information far subtler than any spoken word. Each villager was engaged in a silent negotiation of reputation, of expectation, and of minor advantage. Even the act of acknowledging a curious event, or deliberately ignoring it, carried weight in the complex social calculus of Flaxford. Purbright noted these dynamics, recognizing that motives often resided not in overt action, but in the choices individuals made about what to reveal, conceal, or emphasize. He pondered the duality of appearances and reality in the village. A community so invested in propriety could conceal considerable mischief, yet the same investment ensured that even the smallest disruption produced a cascade of behavioral cues. A hesitation here, a fleeting glance there, a slight alteration of tone. All these subtleties could betray intent far more reliably than confession or evidence. Purbright understood that this quiet interplay of human behavior was as intricate and revealing as any physical clue. In some ways, more so. By the time he reached the edge of the village green, the inspector's reflections had turned to method. He would need to observe, listen, and engage with discretion, allowing the behaviors of the villagers to expose contradictions in time. Direct confrontation would come later, if necessary, but premature intervention risked collapsing the delicate interplay he wished to monitor. In Flaxford, truth often revealed itself only through patience, through careful attention to minor anomalies, and through the study of human habits and motivations in their natural context. The inspector allowed himself a moment of quiet amusement at the predictability of human vanity. Each villager, in their concern over appearances, had unwittingly provided him with material for careful analysis. The disruptions, petals, vegetable and otherwise, were more than mere mischief. They were a lens through which the subtle mechanics of social power, rivalry, and self-interest could be studied. It was not sensational, not theatrical, but it was precise, informative, and profoundly human. As twilight deepened, Purbright turned toward his lodgings with the sense that the next phase of observation would reveal further intricacies. The web of relationships, grievances, and subtle provocations was now apparent, and the patterns he had begun to discern would only grow clearer in time. The village appeared calm, orderly, and polite, yet beneath that tranquility lay the quiet movements of intent, misdirection, and anticipation. And Purbright, as always, moved through it with the unhurried patience of one who understood that in Flaxford As in all places governed by civility, truth revealed itself most clearly to the observer who waited, watched, and listened with careful attention. The morning arrived crisp and bright, and the hall of the garden club seemed almost innocuous once more, its tables neatly arranged, its flowers polished to an impeccable sheen. Yet for Purbright, nothing about the setting was ordinary. Every chair, every potted plant, every casual glance carried potential meaning, and the inspector was aware that subtle provocations could reveal more than direct questioning ever might. Today he intended to test the villagers' reactions, with nothing more than gentle suggestion and observation. He began with Mrs. Elsie Kettle, seated near the window arranging her notes. "I wonder," he said, in a tone designed to be casual yet pointed, "whether someone might take an unusual interest in ensuring that certain flowers remain prominent in a display, even at odd hours." He paused, observing her expression closely. She smiled faintly, adjusted a stray ribbon on a bouquet, and replied with apparent nonchalance that people sometimes care very much for appearances. The subtle hesitation in her voice, the quick glance toward the doorway, hinted at awareness beyond her outward words. Nearby, Lady Witherspoon's eyes flickered as he made the same observation in passing, a delicate raising of the eyebrows as if the inspector had casually confirmed something she had long suspected but dared not voice. She shifted in her seat, smoothing her gloves and murmuring agreement, adding an anecdote about past exhibitions in which displays had mysteriously altered overnight. Purbright noted the precise way her hands tightened slightly, and the faint flush of excitement in her cheeks. The outward politeness concealed inner interest and perhaps anxiety. Mr. Basil Trent, ever eager to offer his perspective, leaned forward and added commentary, asserting that such behavior would be utterly shocking if deliberate, while at the same time betraying subtle pride in his own perceptiveness. Purbright listened patiently, cataloguing the slight contradictions in timing and emphasis, recognizing that these inconsistencies were more revealing than any direct admission of knowledge. Each word, each gesture, each pause contributed to a pattern that only patience could make visible. Purbright allowed the conversation to drift toward the recent anomalies, mentioning them casually as if pondering rather than accusing. "One wonders," he mused aloud, "how small changes, petals shifted, displays altered, might suggest an intelligence guiding them rather than mere mischief." His words were carefully measured, inviting reflection without confrontation. The reactions were immediate, yet subtle. A quick straightening of posture, a fleeting tightening of hands, a brief, imperceptible glance toward a nearby colleague. These micro-signals were the markers of concern and recognition, and Purbright's practiced attention caught each one. At mid-morning, he spoke with the hall steward, ostensibly about general procedures, and observed the impact of indirect implication. The steward, normally meticulous and composed, exhibited slight hesitation, mentioning in passing that he had sometimes noticed objects out of place, but attributed it to ordinary forgetfulness. Purbright, nodding politely, allowed the remark to linger unchallenged, recognizing that the reluctance to elaborate often indicated knowledge the speaker wished to conceal or test. Meanwhile, Dr. Langley, who had remained largely on the periphery, offered a faintly ironic remark about the precision of the vegetable replacement. Purbright replied with mild curiosity, asking how one might differentiate intentional arrangement from accident. The doctor's subtle hesitation, followed by a vague shrug, confirmed that he too had noticed irregularities, but preferred to observe rather than intervene. In this, the inspector saw the faintest suggestion of consensus forming among those aware of the true anomalies. Tom Brindle, present but unassuming, continued to act innocuous, though Purbright observed the occasional tilt of his head, a flicker of interest when the discussion veered toward mischief, and the carefully timed pauses in speech that suggested amusement without complicity. By allowing these observations to accumulate, Purbright gauged the reactions of each villager, noting both conscious and unconscious cues, as he constructed a mental map of likely involvement and hidden awareness. Later, Purbright positioned himself so that the hall's entrance was within view, and he made a subtle comment about the improbability of noticing every minor detail overnight. The statement was deliberately ambiguous, intended to suggest an outside observer could have been present without naming anyone. The reactions were telling: a slight blanching of the face, a rapid adjustment of gloves, a nervous clearing of the throat. These brief signals, fleeting yet unmistakable to his trained eye, indicated discomfort and suggested that someone present had been aware of the nocturnal disruptions. By late afternoon, Purbright had tested multiple villagers in similar fashion, employing gentle, indirect remarks and casual observations to gauge reactions. Each exchange revealed minute discrepancies, subtle cues of anxiety, and fleeting acknowledgments of knowledge or involvement. Nothing was overt, nothing accusatory, yet each carefully orchestrated comment drew responses that collectively illuminated intent, familiarity with the hall's routines, and the likelihood of deliberate action. As the day drew to a close, Purbright reflected on the subtle efficacy of his method. By provoking only gently, by observing reactions to casual remarks and indirect implications, he had begun to delineate the responsible party without ever needing confrontation. The village continued to maintain its outward calm, but beneath the surface the inspector had glimpsed the faint tremor of unease, small enough for the unobservant to miss, but unmistakable to those who understood human nature. The stage was now set. The resolution of these quiet intrigues would come in due course, and the true architect of the disturbances could not long remain concealed from the patient and attentive eye of Inspector Purbright. The hall of the Garden Club had never seemed so still. The usual bustle of whispered commentary and polite laughter had been replaced by a rare, expectant hush. Chairs were arranged neatly, the remaining flowers glimmered under the soft afternoon light, and the villagers had gathered, some out of curiosity, others from a sense of decorum. At the center of the room, standing with his habitual calm, Inspector Purbright prepared to untangle the series of minor disruptions that had captivated the village. He began without preamble, speaking in measured tones that carried authority while remaining entirely civil. It seems we have allowed a few small anomalies, petals displaced, a vegetable replaced, to stir considerable speculation, he said, his gaze sweeping across the assembled faces. Yet, as is often the case in Flaxford, the simplest explanation is rarely the true one. Our assumptions, convenient though they may be, require reconsideration. There were polite murmurs of agreement, though a few faces flushed with anticipation, each villager aware that their own observations and actions were under quiet scrutiny. Purbright continued, carefully cataloguing each element of the puzzle, describing the missing petals and the replaced vegetable, the precise placement of objects, the small details of soil displacement, and the subtle gestures noted among the villagers. He did not accuse, he merely laid out what he had observed, allowing the patterns to speak for themselves. The first assumption, naturally, was that young Tom Brindle acted in mischief, he said, and a few villagers nodded. Yet the timing, the precision, and the deliberate subtlety of these alterations are inconsistent with the impulsive behavior of a child. They suggest knowledge of routines, awareness of the hall's operation, and a careful orchestration designed to mislead. He paused briefly, letting the observations settle among the listeners. Purbright then addressed Mrs. Elsie Kettle and the assistants who had tended the displays. He spoke of small hesitations, minor overcompensations, and the indirect signals of concern they had exhibited during earlier inquiries. "These are the true markers," he said quietly. "Not the outward accusations of misplaced blame, but the subtler signals of engagement with the situation." His gaze lingered ever so slightly on one corner of the room, where he noted a faint stiffening of posture and a barely perceptible blanching of the face. Gradually, he led the assembled villagers through the chain of events, the initial discovery of the petals, the gossip that followed, the replacement of the vegetable, and the minor misalignments of displays. With each step, he highlighted the minor anomalies, footprints, smudges, fleeting gestures, subtle hesitation in speech that collectively revealed intention. The villagers listened, many silently, some exchanging glances of surprise, others of tentative comprehension. Finally, Purbright's explanation narrowed to the central figure behind the disturbances. "The individual responsible," he said with deliberate calm, "is one who is intimately familiar with both the hall and the social rhythms of our village. Someone who understood how minor disruptions would ripple outward, creating confusion and misattribution. The acts were not malicious in a conventional sense, but were driven by a combination of pride, personal interest, and a desire to assert influence over the garden club's outcomes." He paused, allowing the implication to settle. Mrs. Kettle shifted in her seat, her hands fidgeting with a stray ribbon. A faint tightening around the mouth revealed the slightest tension, and Purbright noted it with serene attention. Every small detail, the altered petals, the precise replacement of the vegetable, the placement of objects, was part of this pattern. It was subtle, deliberate, and intended to be almost invisible to the casual observer. The room remained quiet, the soft light catching on the polished surfaces of tables and window panes. Then, with the same calm tone he had maintained throughout, Purbright named the responsible party, linking each anomaly to the person's knowledge, habits, and responses observed over the previous days. The revelation was delivered without drama, without accusation, and without moral flourish, yet its clarity was undeniable. Every minor observation, every hesitation, every incongruity fell into place, forming a coherent pattern that explained the apparent mysteries. The villagers processed the explanation in their own ways. Some nodded in slow recognition, others murmured polite astonishment, and a few leaned back, absorbing the implications of their own unwitting assumptions. Even Mr. Trent, initially insistent upon the guilt of the boy, adjusted his understanding quietly, noting the logic behind Purbright's observations without complaint. The balance between civility and revelation had been maintained, leaving the villagers with clarity, yet preserving the decorum that governed their social interactions. Purbright concluded with a final reflection on human behavior, noting the interplay between appearance and intention, the ways small actions could be amplified into narratives, and how patience, observation, and subtle attention to detail were the keys to understanding. He did not need to emphasize triumph or judgment. The explanation itself, delivered calmly, sufficed to reconcile the minor disruptions with the broader picture of village life. As the assembled group dispersed, the hall returned to a state of quiet order. Flowers gleamed in their carefully tended positions, tables remained aligned, and the subtle hum of ordinary conversation resumed. Purbright, standing near the doorway, watched the villagers leave, satisfied that the intricate puzzle had been revealed in its entirety. Nothing had been rushed, nothing had been forced. The balance between observation, deduction, and human subtlety had produced understanding, and the village, restored to its polite equilibrium, could continue as before, though now with a slightly sharper awareness of the intricacies beneath its surface calm. The morning following the explanation dawned with an air of polite normality over Flaxford. Shop windows gleamed in the soft sunlight, and the faint hum of life along the high street suggested routine and order had returned. Yet for those who observed closely, subtle changes lingered. Faces that had once expressed certainty now carried faint shadows of reflection, and gestures previously effortless were slightly more measured. The village, outwardly restored to its ordinary rhythm, bore the quiet imprint of the recent disturbances. Purbright moved through the streets with his usual measured calm, noting how the residents interacted in ways that were subtly altered by the awareness of their own behaviour. Mr. Basil Trent, for example, still spoke at length on matters of propriety, yet he occasionally paused, a slight hesitation betraying the memory of his earlier misjudgments. Lady Witherspoon continued to monitor the arrangement of flowers with her customary exactitude, but her glances toward the hall were now accompanied by the faintest hint of suspicion, a soft acknowledgment that appearances were not always to be trusted. Even young Tom Brindle navigated the streets with newfound confidence, aware that the attention previously directed at him had shifted elsewhere. His small triumph lay in the quiet satisfaction of having observed events without becoming directly entangled, though he carried a faintly bemused air, conscious of the villagers' lingering assumptions. The boy's composure served as a subtle counterpoint to the self-conscious gestures of the adults, and Purbright noted the balance with mild appreciation. The garden club hall itself seemed almost untouched by the minor upheaval that had occurred. Tables were realigned, flowers carefully positioned, and the air of quiet civility reasserted. Yet those who entered the hall now approached with a slight awareness of the intricacies beneath the surface, a faint glance at a misplaced leaf, the careful adjustment of a display, the soft attention to small movements that might otherwise be ignored. Even the hall steward, typically unnoticed in the grand flow of events, carried himself with an extra measure of alertness, mindful of the delicate balance of observation and discretion that had recently come to the fore. Purbright made his way to the hall in the late morning, settling into a chair near the window. He allowed himself to observe without intervention, cataloguing the subtle traces of altered perception and quiet reflection among the villagers. Miss Whitcomb, the retired teacher, offered gentle remarks on the need for attention to detail, though her eyes flickered toward the corner where minor disruptions had once occurred, betraying a consciousness of events she preferred to frame as instruction rather than observation. The florist arranged his blooms with customary precision, yet each placement was now tinged with cautious calculation. He noticed, with a faint smile, the alignment of petals and leaves, aware that even minor alterations could reveal intention or provoke speculation. Mrs. Pritchard, the hall's housekeeper, moved about with habitual care, but she occasionally paused to inspect surfaces that had once been subtly altered, aware now that even the smallest movement carried significance. In this quiet recalibration, the villagers' behaviours bore the soft imprint of the recent lessons in observation, consequence, and subtlety. Purbright considered the nature of these lingering changes as he sipped his tea. Human behaviour, he reflected, was rarely static, and even minor disturbances could produce enduring shifts in perception, expectation, and social interaction. In Flaxford, as elsewhere, civility and propriety formed the visible surface, yet beneath lay currents of self-interest, observation, and occasional manipulation. The recent events had illuminated these currents, and while the village had resumed its outward routine, the residents now carried a faint awareness that their actions were noted, their gestures interpreted, and their assumptions subject to quiet scrutiny. As the afternoon light softened, Purbright observed the interactions of villagers leaving the hall. Conversations remained polite, yet an undercurrent of attentiveness persisted. Glances exchanged, slight corrections in posture, a measured carefulness in speech that had not been necessary before. Even those previously confident in their judgments exhibited subtle reconsideration, adjusting assumptions and refining awareness in light of recent revelations. The balance of the village had not been disrupted in overt terms, but the social fabric had shifted, delicate threads rewoven with nuance and care. In his quiet reflection, Purbright found satisfaction not in confrontation or scandal, but in the slow, precise unfolding of understanding. The patterns of behavior, the hidden motives, and the minor provocations that had shaped the recent days now revealed themselves in the adjustments of everyday action. Life in Flaxford would continue as it always did, governed by civility, observation, and the imperceptible measures of human pride and curiosity. Yet the subtle echoes of these events, the quiet recalibration of perception, the refined attentiveness of gestures, the soft reconsideration of prior judgments, would persist, a testament to the delicate interplay of character and circumstance. By evening, the village seemed restored to its habitual tranquility. Purbright returned to his lodgings with a calm satisfaction, aware that his patient observation and careful deduction had guided events to resolution without need for overt dramatics. The petals were replaced, the vegetable properly displayed, and the villagers had resumed their routines, though now with a slightly keener awareness of subtlety, human behavior, and the quiet consequences of minor acts. The inspector reflected that in a community such as Flaxford, the smallest disruption could illuminate the hidden rhythms of life far more effectively than any overt display of authority. He set aside his notebook, noting the final impressions of the day, the village restored yet subtly altered, civility intact yet nuanced, human behavior revealed in quiet, persistent ripples. And as night settled over Flaxford, with the lamplight flickering along cobbled streets, Purbright allowed himself the unhurried satisfaction of a case quietly resolved, a mystery unfolded, and a village restored to polite equilibrium, its subtle lessons quietly learned.